Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. I'm your host, Mike Allen. When your calendar reaches the end of November, odds are you're focused on Thanksgiving. Yes, it's the fourth Thursday in November, and it was officially set aside by President Abraham Lincoln as a holiday way back in 1863. But it was 80 years before that, in 1873, another late November day was set aside for celebrations. And it's a celebration that many have forgotten about, Evacuation Day. Simply put, it was the last day the British were in the United States after the end of the Revolutionary War. And in many respects, November 25th is actually the anniversary of the day our new country began to stand on its own 2 feet. Our guest today will tell us why we've forgotten about Evacuation Day and also why it's making a comeback. Jim Kaplan is a New York City attorney. He's co-founder of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, a group he also chairs. Jim will be along in a moment with answers to those 2 questions. This week's trivia question: for more than 2 centuries, its weather forecasts have been right 80% of the time. Who holds that distinction? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know what we're talking about next week. Evacuation Day, November 25th. Not a date that many of us have marked on our calendars for a big celebration. Well, after all, it does compete with Thanksgiving, and also we do have the 4th of July to celebrate the nation's birthday, right? Well, sort of. You see, the 4th celebrates the day we declared our independence from British rule back in 1776. But it really wasn't until 7 years later, in 1783, that we actually had our independence. We secured it and started our new country. And that's what Evacuation Day is really all about. As you're going to hear from our guest today, the actual Evacuation Day was a highly choreographed event which had one very major faux pas in the middle, but we're going to save that story for later. What you do need to know is that it all took place in the very southern part of Manhattan, about as far south as you can get. Today, there's a park right where this all happened. It's called Bowling Green. In fact, Bowling Green is the oldest New York City public park. Importantly, it has a flagpole there, and again, more on that later. Bowling Green Park is on the site of where the very first Dutch military fort was located, back when the Dutch had bought Manhattan Island from Native Americans. Well, near Bowling Green was a restaurant called Fraunces Tavern. The British ate there all the time while they were occupying New York City for 7 years during the Revolutionary War. Well, that tavern still stands, and in fact, it's the oldest structure remaining in New York City. Today, the famous bronze statue of that Wall Street bull stands right next to Bowling Green Park. Our guest today is Jim Kaplan. He's an attorney in New York City, and he co-founded the Lower Manhattan Historical Association and serves as its chairman. Now, Jim used to do very popular all-night walking tours of Lower Manhattan on the 4th of July, and he'd point out what remains to be seen of the architecture from the Revolutionary War era in the city, and he would tell the stories of the history associated with them. Today, we're happy to have him here on Amazing Tales to discuss the last day of British occupation following the American Revolution. So, Jim, it is great to have you on and to really highlight a part of history that unfortunately I think has been forgotten by the overwhelming majority of people, even New York City residents, Evacuation Day in New York City. And to set the stage, this ended 7 years of British military occupation in the city of New York during the Revolutionary War. And, even though the major fighting had ended in 1781, it took 2 years to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, so it was 1783, and finally the end of 1783, when it's time for the British now to pack up and leave. And it's not so simple as just, okay, we're going to get the soldiers and march out. There were a lot of people in New York City who wanted the British to win the Revolutionary War, the Loyalists. What happened to them?
New York City, as you may or may not know, was basically the British headquarters during the American Revolution. The British basically took over New York City. So people who favored the British and were against the Patriots would tend to gather in New York City, and many of the upper class were landowners, and therefore they were protected. Under the New York state law, actually, after the Revolution, anybody who sided with the British was subject to having their property forfeited. This was really the haven for loyalists throughout the war. So it was a great consternation when the British were going to leave and the Americans took over. That was going to be a very difficult thing because there was tremendous hostility between the Patriots and the Tories, so to speak. 11,000 Patriots had died in prison ships in Wallabout Bay during the war, so there was no love lost between people who had sided with the revolution and the Tories. And the question was, how are they to be protected? In fact, the Treaty of Paris said that property rights of the British would be protected. That was part of the reason the British agreed to have American independence. So there was tremendous fear that there would be actual riots.
So these two rivals had to sit down and actually talk to each other and work things out to make sure that Evacuation Day was going to happen without any serious problems.
There was extensive negotiations between George Washington and the representatives of the Patriots and between Guy Carleton, who was the lead British negotiator. By November 25th, 1783, was supposed to work that the Americans would march down Broadway and would take control of the city. The British Army and the British supporters would leave. They would leave on boats to Nova Scotia. And in many cases, these were people who had lived here in New York for generations. They were, in a sense, the upper class were going to have to leave their homes and go to Canada. They didn't know what things would be like thereafter. Were they going to be massacred? How would they be treated by the new American government? So Evacuation Day was a very important day, very important. For 150 years thereafter, it was celebrated as a major holiday here in New York City.
So this day was very orchestrated, right? It was there was a cannon that was shot off, and that's when the British troops finally move out, and the Americans were going to march down, George Washington leading the way down Broadway with Governor George Clinton of New York and General Knox with his 800 American soldiers. Tell us, from what we know of the writings and histories and eyewitness accounts, what was that like?
Obviously, for the Patriots, it was a great day. For the British, it was a terrible day. By arrangement, Washington was to march down Broadway and take control at Bowling Green, where there was a flagpole, and he was to raise the American flag and the British flag was to come down. Now, it didn't quite work out that way because the British refused to take down their flag. In fact, they greased the pole so that the Americans couldn't get up and raise their flag. And that caused considerable consternation because this had been orchestrated by the Patriots and by the Continental Army that would be, a smooth ceremony. But it was anything but smooth because the Americans couldn't raise the flag because the British had greased the pole. So what happened was Washington, who was a fairly formal guy, said that he would not enter the city unless the American flag was flying. But the advance guard of Americans were not able to get the flag up because it had been greased by the British. Finally, a young soldier, some say sailor, named John Van Arsdale, bought some cleats from a hardware store and shimmied up the flag and pulled down the British flag and raised the American flag. And there was a great tumult among patriots. By the way, the population of New York was only about 12,000 at the time. It wasn't like today. And then they marched to Fraunces Tavern, where they had a dinner.
Jim, do we know much more about this Van Arsdale guy?
John Van Arsdale was about 28 years old at the time. He was obviously part of the advance crew. And he would, until he was 80 in 1838, every day on Evacuation Day, November 25th, There would be a ceremony at Bowling Green where he would raise the flag. And when he died, his son would raise the flag. And when his son died, his grandson would raise the flag. So that was a very important day in America and New York City history. Some say it was similar to July 4th, or even more important than July 4th. 100 years later, in 1886, there was a huge ceremony organized by the Sons of the Revolution and other patriotic groups, in which it is said that perhaps 1 million people marched on Evacuation Day to celebrate the American victory. The statue of George Washington, which you see in front of Federal Hall, was erected by John Quincy Adams Ward on that day. So you cannot underestimate the importance of Evacuation Day here in New York City.
So going back to the original Evacuation Day, after Washington and Clinton and Knox and the 800 troops got into Bowling Green and they finally got the flag raised, as you started to say, they then retired to Fraunces Tavern for a big dinner, and they had these famous 13 toasts.
You have to understand, this was a period of high euphoria. They had just won the American Revolution. There were toasts to the French, to the Swedish, to all the Allies, to the Army. But my favorite toast is the last toast, and they're given today. Every year we have an Evacuation Day dinner. My favorite is, "May the remembrance of this day be a lesson to princes." That was the last toast. And what they were saying was that in a world where most governments were kings and monarchies, we're going to be a new idea. We're going to be democracy, and we will ultimately prevail in the world. And that was a very bold thing to say, because they didn't know how the American government would play out. They didn't know whether the American Revolution was going to work, but they had tremendous optimism. And they said, "May the remembrance of this day be a lesson to princes." In other words, they were throwing down the gauntlet to monarchies around the world that a new age is coming, an age of democracy. Now, today, most governments in the world are democracies, but they certainly weren't in 1783.
Now, Jim, the other thing that happened at Fraunces Tavern that I'd love for you to comment on occurred 9 days, as I understand it, after Evacuation Day. And this is when it was time for George Washington, after this long, long war, to finally bid farewell to his troops. And this happened at Fraunces Tavern, the oldest surviving structure in New York City, and you can still go down there and have a great dinner, and you guys have the evacuation dinner there every year. But tell me what we know about what it was like when George Washington made his farewell address.
The question was he going to be a king? Was he going to stay? But he just decided that he would retire. He gave what was called his farewell address to his men, to his army, his officers. And it was at the Fraunces Tavern. I think you're right, it was 9 days after. That's another very important event that occurred at Fraunces Tavern. I consider Fraunces Tavern to be probably the most historically important place in New York City in terms of the Revolutionary War. It's perhaps not as well known as it should be. There's an excellent restaurant there, and there's also a museum upstairs. So it's really become a center of early American history in New York City.
Now, you made an interesting comment before, and I want to follow up on it because you're not the first to make this comment, and you won't be the last. Evacuation Day, in many ways, is as important as July 4th. I mean, on one, we're declaring our independence. On the other, we actually earned our independence. It was over, and America started. And yet, Evacuation Day obviously has sort of fallen by the wayside, but thanks to you and your group, you're having a resurgence. You're bringing it back, and as you point out, a lot of people in southern Manhattan, south of Canal Street, that's the most rapidly growing portion of New York City in terms of residential growth, and a lot of those people don't understand this history. So tell me what you are able to do and what you are doing to keep Evacuation Day alive.
Evacuation Day went on as a major celebration, but over time there was some infighting between various groups. And in 1916, at the time of World War I, there was tremendous pro-British sentiment. And Evacuation Day was sometimes considered an anti-British holiday. And the mayor at the time was a fellow named John Purroy Mitchell, who was a great Anglophile. And he decided that they would stop having official Evacuation Day ceremonies. His view was that this was an anti-British holiday, and we didn't want to alienate our allies, who was the British in World War I. So the official ceremony dropped, and basically it was more or less forgotten for many, many years. For the 200th anniversary of Evacuation Day, the Francis Tavern Museum did have a ceremony, and they did have an exhibit on Evacuation Day. And I believe that was when the so-called Evacuation Day dinners at Francis Tavern began, but it was not well known to other people other than the people who hung out at Francis Tavern, which was largely the Sons of the Revolution and patriots like that. In fact, I think there was a feeling that nobody really in New York City was interested in Revolutionary War history other than people whose ancestors had fought in it. And I felt that was entirely wrong. There are 70,000 people who are going to be living here in Lower Manhattan, and they're interested in the history of the United States and the history of New York. So we should celebrate it more widely. And for the first time, we held a ceremony at Bowling Green where we raised the Evacuation Day flag at the same time as Evacuation Day, which was about 12 o'clock on November 25th. I think there were probably about 15 or 20 people there. And we kept doing it every year. This was 12 years ago. And last year we had 500 people. So we're trying to revive the whole idea of Evacuation Day as part of a broader effort to revive the importance of Lower Manhattan as really a major center of Revolutionary War history. We believe it's just as important as Boston, Philadelphia, because this is where many of the things occurred, and particularly Evacuation Day, which was the final end of the American Revolution, should be celebrated here in New York as a major holiday.
After George Washington's farewell address at Francis Tavern, each of his officers came up one by one silently to shake his hand and say goodbye. Well, Washington reportedly spoke no words because he was fighting back tears, and, as it said, not very successfully. He would leave later that day, taking a barge from Manhattan across the Hudson River to New Jersey, and then start his horseback journey back home to his beloved Mount Vernon location in Virginia. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Like Don Quixote tilting at windmills, Jim Kaplan and his dedicated group of supporters are fighting rather long odds to spark a resurgence in the recognition of Evacuation Day. But by all accounts, they're beginning to have great success. I want to thank Jim Kaplan for being our guest today, a New York City attorney by day, and in his off time, chairman and co-founder of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. The answer to this week's trivia question: for more than 2 centuries, its weather forecasts have been right 80% of the time. Who holds that distinction? Well, of course, it's the Old Farmer's Almanac. Next week on Amazing Tales, a look back at this iconic publication. It's the original and oldest-running almanac in the United States, a staple of farmers throughout New England literally for centuries and now throughout the United States, and a publication that uses a proprietary formula to predict the weather months ahead of time. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.